Hey, how you doing? We've had an awful lot of fun recently looking at the writing of Walter Armstrong, a fairly prolific wrestling writer from the late 1800s who seemed to spend a lot of time foaming at the mouth because of dirty foreign wrestling. I thought it might be interesting to try and find out a little about who he really was. When you start looking into Walter Armstrong, the first possible person who appears is Walter Armstrong, born in Scotland in 1850, who was educated at Oxford, went on to be the director of the National Gallery of Ireland. He wrote many influential books on famous artists such as Gainsborough and Reynolds and was eventually knighted. But that's not our Walter. He'd have fitted beautifully alongside Roland George Allenson Wynne, 5th Lord Headley, but no. Our Walter Armstrong was a very different man indeed. He was a regular correspondent in the letters section of Sporting Life, who kindly published his address, which gives us a nice starting point to find him. They have him at number 60 Loughborough Road in Brixton. Electoral registers and censuses agree, and we can use them to find more detail. The first record I managed to find that looks to relate to him shows him as living with his uncle in Dumfries, aged 13. Whether he actually lived there, or was simply there on the night of the census, we don't know. But the records show him as having been born in Scotland, though this may not actually be our Walter, as we'll see later. The next we see of him is in London, where he's married to Emma, and together they have 4 children born between 1867 and 1872, 3 girls and 1 boy. Census records place the family in the same house for many years. In 1871 he's listed as a tea clerk, in 1881 as an unemployed carman, and in 1891 as a reporter, by which time the only child left at home was his son Harley. By 1901, Walter appears to have moved out, as Emma and Harley are still in number 60 Loughborough Road, and Emma is listed as the head of the household. In 1911, their daughter Minnie is back with them, but Walter's still nowhere to be seen. So where was he? Well, it turns out there were plenty of other records of Walter from that period in time. In 1884, he stood trial at the Old Bailey, where he pleaded guilty to deception and forgery and was sentenced to 8 months' hard labour. He had a number of cheques, and he forged other people's signatures, and together with a small gang, they attempted to cash these cheques to get money that was not theirs. In 1890, he stood trial again, this time for stealing, and was sentenced to 10 months. In 1893, he was declared bankrupt and found guilty of 17 counts of intent to defraud. In the census record of 1901, we do have a Walter Armstrong, who's approximately the right age, and listed as a newspaper reporter, living 3 miles up the road in Lambeth as a lodger. So while in 1891 he was still at home, he'd moved out for good a decade later, whether at his instigation or that of his wife, or maybe their adult son. We'll probably never know, but interestingly, the census in 1901 lists him as having been born in Carlisle, in Cumberland, whereas all the earlier censuses list him as having been born in Scotland. Carlisle would make more sense, because one of the things we actually know for certain about him was that he had a lifetime's association and a clear passion, almost obsession, for Cumberland and Westmorland wrestling. And the Scottish census of 1881 does list a Walter Armstrong, born in 1838 in Dumfries, as a shoemaker, still living in Dumfries. So it's possible, even likely, that the original Walter, born in Dumfries, was never actually our Walter. But that doesn't explain why the English censuses of 1871, 1881 and 1891 all state he was born in Scotland. Yet the census of 1901 has him as being born in Carlisle. Who knows? It's clear that he was a little free and easy with the truth if it looked like it might be to his favour. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that he simply reinvented himself a little in order to more closely fit the persona he'd created as secretary of the Cumberland and Westmorland Wrestling Society, leading authority on that sport, and as the journalist known as Cross Buttocker. There's no denying he did a lot for the sport, as a wrestler, as a judge, and as a writer. But sadly, there's also no denying that he held deep ingrained prejudices that come through only too clearly in his books, and that his personal life was not that of a man anyone would want as the figurehead of a wrestling association. He shows up a few more times in court records, more often than not as a witness, or as a victim of assault, before finally being admitted to St George's Workhouse in Southwark in April of 1917. By Christmas of that year, he was dead. It'd be very easy to judge him harshly when seen in comparison to other writers of the time, like Hutton, Castle, Matthey, or even Alanson Wynne, who were born into wealth and privilege. But the reality of the situation is that life in Victorian London, for a man who struggled to find employment and yet still had to support a family of 4 children, would not have been simple. That isn't an excuse for what he did, but it would at least explain why he was always so angry. Before I finish, I just want to shout out to Sarah from grapplingwithhistory.com, whose wonderful website I found after I'd done a lot of this research, only to see that she'd already done a lot of it before me. If you have an interest in the wrestling of the late 1800s and early 1900s, then I can't recommend her site enough. Thank you very much for sticking it out to the very end of the video. Fight team. I'll see you soon.